doing? Good? How's everyone's energy on day 3? Yeah, it's the penultimate day. We have only one more day to go. Who has a little bit of brain drain? Show of hands. A little tired. Yeah, we understand.
There's a lot of information at these sessions, isn't there? Just a ton to absorb.
Every now and again, Joel and I get to go to a session as an attendee. We've both been speaking for about 13 or 14 years professionally at Tech Ed and other events. Like usually at Mix or PDC, we get the opportunity to actually attend the session and like you guys, and it's actually a really good experience because we forget how tired you guys are in the audience. We're sitting there, and I always yell at you guys, close your laptops, don't send emails, and what do you think we do when we go to these sessions? We're like sitting there, typing emails away, and usually to each other. Like, Joel, did you see what the speaker
Actually, because of that, I invented something called the J scale. J standing for Joel, for no apparent reason. But it actually measures the synaptic activity in your brain. And there's this magical level where you're at 3 or 4, and you're kind of nodding off, or everything kind of makes sense, and everything that I say, you just nod. Right? I could ask you, so how old are you? Yeah. What we're going to try to do is kind of keep you above that line a little bit, so things kind of sink in a bit more than what you would normally sink in below that line. So that's our goal.
So before we introduce ourselves formally, I think you already got a little bit of an introduction right now. You can kind of tell our personalities. I will tell you a little bit about the session, of how we're going to run this particular session. We're going to talk about the Agile buffet table, though they left table off. I blame...
It didn't fit on the slide.
It didn't fit on the slide. So we're going to talk about the Agile buffet table. If that's a little confusing if you think it's a new Agile methodology. No, it really is a buffet table. They just removed the picture of the buffet table, the Tech Ed people. But this is I hate to use the term, but it's an Agile talk on Agile. So we have like 500 slides, and we have no intention of going over even 50% of them. We're going to bring up the slides as needed, and we're going to talk to you about, a quick review about the Agile Manifesto, a quick review about XP, Scrum, and we'll introduce Kanban a little bit, but not deeply, because we're going to talk about Kanban tomorrow. And then we're going to look at the tenets of those 3 Agile methodologies and put them all on the buffet table. And then we're literally going to build a unique Agile methodology on the fly in front of all of you, taking the best pieces of each one based on scenarios. We hope to get a lot of Q&A, or at least a lot of shouting, like, no, that's wrong, or that's great, whichever one you prefer. We prefer that's great, but you can easily say that's wrong. So we're going to try to be dynamic. We're going to try, I hate to use the term, but we're going to try to be agile in this particular talk, to get you down that road of building a custom Agile methodology. Don't worry, we're going to tell you why you want to do this. That's actually the first 15 minutes or so. So we'll spend probably the first 15 minutes or so kind of setting up the problem. Then we'll probably spend another 15 minutes on the 3 methodologies. Then we'll spend the last 45 minutes or so going through the actual buffet table, so to speak.
So before we get going, I want to point out that we have a tweet and win up there. And at the end of the session, I will be drawing for 3 licenses of Team Pulse, which is...
Tell them what Team Pulse is.
It's an Agile project management tool that integrates really, really well with TFS. It's worth about $250. I think your phone is making weird noises.
Okay.
It's worth about $250 a pop, so I'll be randomly choosing from the tweets that we get up from the Twitter tag, and I'll be randomly selecting one of those and reaching back out to you over Twitter with how you can claim your license. So if you've got your phones, keep them on silent, but use them to tweet like mad. The more you tweet, the more opportunities you have to win. Just saying.
He's just saying. He's a Twitter whore, I'll admit that.
He's a Twitter whore.
Okay, so quick about us. My name is Stephen Forte, and that is my Twitter handle as well. Works on my PC for obvious reasons. It's one of the most used phrases in computer science ever. It's kind of like, Watson, where is, Jane, stop this crazy thing. So I'm a Microsoft Regional Director for the New York region, even though I live in Hong Kong. I know that's confusing, but that's interesting. I'm a certified Scrum Master. I'm an MVP with SQL Azure. And I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of Telerik, which is based in Europe. So as I said yesterday, if you saw my session, I'm from New York, and I work for a European company, and I live in Asia. So I'm always jet lagged.
He's messed up. I'm also a Microsoft Regional Director, and again, it's a weird title because I don't work for Microsoft, I don't have a region, I don't direct a damn thing. But it's a great title to have. Everybody thinks I'm his boss.
Looks good on the resume.
Sounds good.
Looks good on the resume.
I'm also an executive VP for Telerik, and I'm actually in charge of the Team Pulse product line for Telerik. And we both have been doing Agile since before we actually knew it was Agile.
Right.
And it's actually some of the basis of what we wanted to talk about today. So one of the reasons why we have this session is we were starting to get angry with, we go to these Agile sessions and we hear people say, you can't be Agile if you're not Scrum. You can't be Agile if you're not doing test-driven development. You can't be Agile if. You can't be Agile if this. Wow, there's a lot of rules to Agile. And
we thought Agile was about being agile, right? The
Right.
textbook definition of Agile, responding to change, right? So what we went ahead and did is we looked at the certified Scrum Master material, we looked at all the methodologies, and we decided how many people, let me actually do it a different way. Let me take an audience poll. Show your hand if you're practicing some form of Scrum. Okay, so almost everyone in the room, probably 85% of the room. I'm going to take another poll. Who's using the brand new Agile methodology called Scrum But? You know what I mean by that? I use Scrum, but I made these changes. No one? Okay, a handful of people. More hands are going up, probably about 30% of the room. And what we found out is when you are starting to change the Agile methodology, you're being very agile, meaning you're adapting the Agile methodology to your environment. Unfortunately, we're told by the practitioners of XP and Scrum and some of the other methodologies that that's wrong, that that's bad. And we're here to tell you that that's okay. Not only are we here to tell you that that's okay, we're here to tell you how to actually do it.
Right, because one of the things, as an Agile coach, I used to work with many, many organizations around the world on helping to adopt Agile practices within the organization. And one of the things that we were very careful about was to not just pretend that we were doing Scrum and call it Scrum. We've worked into a lot of organizations where, hey, what methodology do you guys use? Oh, we're Agile. Cool. So what Agile methodology do you use? Scrum. Great. So do you do daily stand-ups? No. Oh, okay. Do you do
Sprint retrospectives?
Sprint retrospectives? Yeah, no. Okay. So what about Scrum do you do? We don't do any docs. We don't write docs or design. We're Agile. Perfect. Here's your sign, right? Here's your sticker.
And we're not advocating this.
We're not advocating
This
that.
actually does Scrum and Agile in general a disservice.
In fact, because of that, Agile has had a little bit of a bad rap. I actually, this is a true story, was escorted out of a building. This was in Europe because I told people that I was going to help their team learn Agile. Out you go. Because it says, listen, we're about business here, not about the developers. And there was a really bad rap that, well, Agile is always about the developers. It's about making life better for the developers. It's about letting them be unaccountable for the things that they're doing. And the reality is in our experience, Agile is about discipline. It's about learning how to do things based on the need of the processes that you're working within, based on the needs of the organization that you're working within, based on the needs of the team. And what we're going to try to advocate is that there's a plethora of different Agile practices scattered about a number of different Agile methodologies, and it might make sense for you to start pull them in. Over the last couple of years, I've been doing talks on lean manufacturing principles as it applies to software engineering, Kanban, Scrum. I think last year I did a session on something that we called Scrumban, which is a mixture of Kanban and Scrum. And it's all kind of based on this premise of let's use the right practices for the right need and learn how to identify those needs and then identify the practices that fit those needs for you to bring those practices in and ultimately reduce waste and become more efficient.
So one of the things that we like to do, just real quickly, here's kind of our agenda. We're going to talk very briefly for 5 minutes or less about the Agile Manifesto, and you'll see why in just a minute, or we're going back in time 10 years. Then we're going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes about the three methodologies that we find are the most influential. In the past, it was XP, present day Scrum, and what we think in the future is Kanban. So we're going to talk a little bit about the tenets of those three methodologies for about 15 minutes or so. And then what we're going to do is spend the rest of the session designing, as I said, the buffet table, eating from the buffet table. So real briefly, we told you before, is it okay to change Scrum? But oops, I'm going the wrong direction. What I want to do is talk about the Agile Manifesto. And what Joel was just talking about is when he started thinking about these methodologies, the Agile Manifesto, has anyone here read or signed the Agile Manifesto at agilemanifesto.org? I encourage you all to do so because it's the core foundation of what we're talking about today. The Agile Manifesto was written 10 years ago, back in February. It just celebrated its 10-year anniversary. And it's very, very simple. It's written by a bunch of guys that said, we're sick of the way we're building software. They were using these Agile methodologies, but they had no brands. They had no names. They were just kind of performing iterations. They were doing kind of stand-up meetings. They were doing things like test-driven development and continuous integration. And they got together and they wrote the manifesto, and it stressed 4 things. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. That doesn't mean tools and process are unimportant. It just says we stress individuals and interactions far more, which really means we're focusing on communication. Okay? If you have to think of one thing, you're focusing on communication.
Ultimately, software development is not about technology at all. It's about human interaction, period. In the 18 years that I've been developing software, there's been only one thing that's determined the success of a project, and it's the way that the teams interact with one another. Not what tools that they use, not what programming languages they use, not anything else other than just the way the teams and the business interact with one another. That is the single most important aspect, and that's something that they recognize as well, and why it's the #1 aspect in this particular slide.
So we look at also working software over comprehensive documentation. Again, it's just stressing one over the other. It's not saying eliminate documentation. And collaboration with the customer, back what Joel was just talking about. I thought your phone was on silent, Joel.
I undid that.
Oh, okay. And then respond. It's when you were tweeting. And then responding to change. And this is what we find more important, is today we've gotten probably locked into an Agile an Agile methodology. Specifically today, probably Scrum. We went to the training classes, we've read the books, and we're trying to follow all the rules. And one of the core rules of Scrum is do not change Scrum. But in my opinion, one of the core tenets of the Agile Manifesto is responding to change, which means, by definition, our methodologies should be flexible. By definition, our methodologies should be agile.
I just want to clarify one thing that you said. Scrum doesn't necessarily mean don't change Scrum. It actually says don't change Scrum and call it Scrum. That's
True,
one of
true.
the things
That's a good.
Yeah, so don't call what you do Scrum if you're not really doing Scrum.
Which, to be fair, is a fair assessment. You don't want to spoil the brand. So one of the signers of the, I almost said Declaration of Independence. That's kind of funny. One of the signers of the Agile Manifesto, Mike Combe, wrote a blog post back in February called Reflections on 10 Years Since the Agile Manifesto. And he said 10 years ago, he had similar experiences that Joel did. He was basically shouted down, beaten down, and thrown out of offices for suggesting to use Agile. And he said, we've come a long way in 10 years that now we're pretty much legit with the Agile methodologies. What he says he hopes will happen in the next 10 years is that the brands go away, that we actually build our custom methodologies based on the needs, as long as we adhere to the values of the Agile Manifesto. I'm going to say that one more time because that is the core tenet of this particular class. Right? Meaning is, what we're looking to evolve to in the future is away from the actual brands, Scrum, XP, Kanban, building our own methodologies using the tenets from those brands, as long as we adhere to the values of the Agile Manifesto. And that's what we're going to try to go through today. So, as I said, Agile is about values, not rules, not a rigid adherence to processes, and responding to change. So we're not going to go through these principles of Agile. As I said, this is going too slow, so I'll go here. Because what we want to do now is actually kind of fast forward a little bit and talk about the influential Agile methodologies.
Now, there's a bunch. Now, we could have, our initial slide when we went through this, we probably had about 11 of them listed out. But then we started to realize there's really just 3. There's really just 3 that have really impacted, in our opinion, the industry as we know it. The first and foremost is XP. I mean, XP was the first kind of, I put quotes on the word formalized, but defined Agile methodology that was really considered Agile, that was really embraced by the Agile community. It's like, we're doing XP, therefore we're Agile. So we're going to talk a little bit about XP. And of course, we have to talk about Scrum because Scrum, by far, is the most popular Agile methodology out there in orders of magnitude. And for good reason. It provides us a lot of structure, a lot of discipline, and it's very, very simple for teams to follow and to modify. But we're also going to be talking about something that we consider the future, which is something that is called Kanban. Now, Kanban isn't new. Kanban actually comes from the lean manufacturing world. It's not something that we've invented or the Agile community has invented, but we are embracing in the Agile community because it makes a lot of sense for us. So we'll talk a little bit about what Kanban is, where it came from and how it applies to software engineering. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, how do these fit together? How can we kind of choose some of the best areas of each of these to suit our particular needs?
All right, so let's actually go through XP, and let's actually just, a quick show of hands. Anyone here have worked with XP in the past or even currently? Okay, so a small amount of folks, about a dozen people maybe. XP came about probably about, 12 years ago or so with a book by Kent Beck called Extreme Programming. And it really was a reaction to, the dot-com era and software being very expensive and taking a long time to build. And it suggested, at the time, some very radical approaches that back in 1998 were radical. Today, we take a lot of these for granted. So it shows how kind of XP has become very mainstream. Because it was written by engineers, and I call it the first stab at an Agile methodology, a lot of XP is built around engineering practices. For example, let's actually go to the next slide. And these are the core practices of XP. Okay? So some of them were, let's sit the team together. Right, get that communication going. So very early on in the days of Agile, even before the Agile Manifesto, we realized communication was a problem. But some of the other tenets were continuous integration, right? So getting developers actually to check in code was a big deal in 1998. Anyone remember those days? Was a manager in those days? I was a CTO of a .com, 1999, 2000, 2001, and I honestly spent 50% of my time on what I call enforcement. Code reviews, but not code reviews looking, are you writing your code in a very nice way, but more like, are you following the coding standards? Are you following our naming conventions? Are you commenting your code? All stuff that we automate today with FX cop, style cop, gated check-in. I was spending a lot of time getting developers to check in code, right? Just getting code checked in. We used a system called Star Team at the time. And just getting the source code into Star Team was an effort. So I said I spent 50% of my time. So the XP really focused a lot on those engineering practices and brought things like pair programming. Sitting two programmers together and doing what's called ping pong programming, right? Where you would actually write, I have function get customer, this parameter, that parameter, return this. And then the next programmer who was sitting next to it would actually write the function. And then they would swap. Right, so one developer writes the stub, the other developer fills in the actual method. So two sets of eyes are better than one.
And a lot of these things make a lot of practical sense for us. I mean, things like, the whole team, an informative workspace, even the use of stories to describe the interaction between the user and the computer, and the value that the user gets out of the interaction are pretty common sense stuff that weren't, they were kind of evolutions of what we already knew, but there are some controversial things in here. I mean, you just mentioned
pair programming is one of them.
Pair programming, people went, oh, we want to do XP, but we don't want to do pair programming because that's a waste of time. I can't afford two developers to work on the same lines of code. And a lot of people, they were doing XP but because they wanted to do XP, all this other stuff, except for pair programming because it just couldn't make sense. The other thing that people had a really hard time adopting was Slack. You got a really great story about what Slack is. But a lot of people just did not want to even consider the concept of Slack in their environment.
Does anyone know what Slack is? A few people only. There's a great book written by Tom DeMarco called Slack. It should win a Pulitzer Prize, in my opinion. And what Slack is very simple. He used it to describe in the 1980s in the United States, or in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, corporate America was doing very well, and every executive had their own secretary. And that secretary would do all the typing, they would do all the phone calls. However, that secretary was probably extremely underutilized. That secretary probably only worked 50% of the time. So when the executive needed that secretary, they would go to his or her desk and say, hey, I got a really important thing come up, can you do this right away? And because they had the slack, because they were underutilized, they would jump right to it and be extremely effective and extremely useful. What happened was, in the late 80s, early 90s, with all the mergers and acquisitions and the downsizing, the geniuses in the management consulting groups turned around and said, oh, these resources are underutilized. These 3 executives now need to share one secretary. That secretary's slack evaporated. So the things that made that secretary awesome, the slack, the responsiveness, now made that secretary ineffective because the slack was removed. So translating that to computer projects, XP said, this is happening to our our programming teams. And our programming teams lack the slack in the actual project itself to be effective. They lack the slack to actually make the project go smoother.
And this kind of went against the norm of your typical project managers. Like, wait a second, he's got 4% more utilization that I can fill in here. I have to fill my Gantt chart. The line has to go all the way across.
I remember once I had the CEO of my .com, this was in 2000, the height of the .com craziness, and she goes, how come Patrick's, how come your Microsoft project, because that's what we used at the time, right, 10, 12 years ago, how come there was that little feature that you could just put utilization in, and I think we put the team at 80%. And she goes, how come it's 80%? If we switch that to 100%, like a normal team, we'll finish the project in 6 months instead of 9 months. And I said, oh, because developers don't get up and use the bathroom? I said, developers, don't actually go to a training class one day or call in sick, or we don't get stuck on something that we didn't anticipate. And you saw the pictures from Nepal. I'm a big hiker, so I use analogies, and Joel says I make bad analogies all the time, but I thought this was a particularly good one. I said, starting the project at 100% utilization is like starting a hike in the winter at 4 p.m. without any water and without any shoes on. Right? And she's like, of course she looked at me like I had 12 heads and said, make it 100%, because she was the CEO. But I tried to explain the concept of slack. I even bought her the book. Unfortunately, well, luckily for me, she was eventually let go. So. Anything else you want to cover on XP?
No.
I think the key takeaways on XP, it was a reaction, mostly in the 90s, in the boom years of the 90s, Slack really got eliminated from development teams, and development teams became less productive but were expected to do more, and they stopped communicating with the users, they stopped communicating with the business, and they also started, we started getting these engineering practices that were new. So XP was a reaction to all of that.
Now, there's been a number of studies by Gartner and by Forrester that are now proclaiming that Agile is now mainstream. That's wonderful. It's taken 10 years. But I think the industry has acknowledged that it is a very powerful mindset to work within. And the reason that it is mainstream, in my humble opinion, is because of Scrum. Scrum is a methodology that has been around for quite a while. In fact, dates back further.
It dates back to the 80s in Japan, where Honda wanted to build new cars. And they came up with a methodology that they called Scrum. It's actually a Harvard Business School article that you can still get for free called The New Product Development Game, written by, I forget the guy's name, 2 Japanese guys from Honda. And they talked about the rugby analogy. They said that right now we're running a relay race, right? You're passing off, design documents get passed off to developers, get passed off to QA, get passed off to, implementation. And they said take the more rugby approach where you go down the field together as a unit. Hence why I'm wearing a rugby jersey, the Hong Kong home team jersey, and Joel's wearing the Canadian home team jersey. And at the Rugby World Cup in Hong Kong this year, the Rugby Sevens, Canada won its bracket. And I actually text Joel, and then he texts me back, dude, it's 4 o'clock in the morning. I was very excited for him.
I don't know why I actually answered my phone at 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, one of the great things about Scrum is it actually is fairly rigid, but it's also quite simple. There's not a huge amount of rules by which we have to follow. But it also does not address engineering practices. So all those engineering things that we talked about in XP don't actually have any position within the Scrum framework. In fact, Scrum is about the way that the teams operate, that the cycles they're in, the behavior that the teams need to exude on a regular basis. And in fact, it's very cyclical in nature. In fact, the core component of a Scrum project is something called a sprint, which is a fixed date iteration, anywhere between 1 week and 4 weeks, but we don't like to have that very long. Some teams have very short iterations, like 1 week. Some teams like to have 4, but our experience is most teams have sprints around 2 weeks these days. Raise your hand if you have 4-week iterations if you're using Scrum. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, about 10. Raise your hand if you're using 2 weeks. Pretty much everyone else.
And shout out if you're using something different.
Yeah.
We had a guy do 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
That's because they're Dutch. The Dutch do things differently.
Yeah.
3 weeks as well. Anyone doing 1 week? 1 week?
Anybody doing anything less than a week?
I used to do that, and then I realized I was doing Kanban.
Yeah.
I wrote a blog post about it. Anyone doing like 6 weeks or 8 week sprints? I saw a guy, I think it was from Boeing or Lockheed Martin yesterday. He was doing 6 week sprints, and it made sense when I talked to him.
It also, one of the things that we also talk about is that Scrum is revolutionary because it decided to turn things on its side and use completely different language and use completely different mindset on how to approach the structure of a team. You might notice on a previous slide here that if you take a look at our team on the side here, we have a product owner. Okay, that's not so revolutionary. But is there a project manager on this? There's no project manager. We have something called a Scrum Master. And traditional organizations go, oh, Scrum Master, that must be the project manager on Scrum.
No.
It's not at all. Scrum Master and a Scrum team is responsible for making sure that the team is following Scrum. Not necessarily that they have the right schedules, that they're adhering to what their commitments are.
And to remove impediments.
Or planning. And their also job is to remove blockers from the team, is to remove things that get in the way of the team to make sure that we're reducing waste and they're the most efficient. And then there's the team, the users, and the stakeholders. So we've kind of removed a lot of the structure and we wanted to embody the concept of a cross-functional team. And the reason that we like to have cross-functional teams is to prevent handoffs, right? There's nothing worse than, I just write DB scripts. That's my job on a team.
My sole purpose in life.
Right? So what does that allow me to do? Well, it allows me to write DB scripts. So how effective am I going to be across the life cycle of a particular project? Well, I'm probably going to be used here and there. I'll probably be scattered across many different projects because that's the only thing I can do. So since I can't be full-time on one project, I'll be 5% utilized on 20 projects, which is a fallacy, right? We know that that doesn't quite work. But the problem is that we don't like handoffs. Every time we do a handoff between people, there's waste. There's loss of context. There's loss of commitment. There's loss of understanding. It's a very loss-full type of environment. So when we have cross-functional teams, we work together and we prevent handoffs. And that actually reduces the waste and error, or the potential for error when we're doing our engineering practices.
So since most of us know Scrum, we kind of blasted through Scrum and we went through XP. But we want to keep getting back to these core practices slides. So just as we focused a moment ago with XP, we talked about the core practices of XP, where we talked about Slack and continuous integration. We want to bring up this slide because these are the items we're going to put on the buffet table shortly. But we still need to introduce Kanban and spend 5 minutes or so on Kanban and introduce the features of Kanban. So these are kind of the core tenets of Scrum. Whether you're using them or not, this is what the textbook will tell you. Right, so as Joel mentioned, a cross-functional team, which I always find very difficult. On paper, it's great, but it's very difficult to implement. Scrum introduces the concept of the fixed iteration, a little bit more formal than XP does, by calling it a sprint and putting structure and ceremony around that actual sprint. So while XP prescribed iterative development, Scrum really formalizes it by having the sprint planning meeting, taking out of the backlog and putting into the sprint backlog, the burn down chart, then the sprint review meeting, the sprint retrospective, and then kind of lather, rinse, repeat, doing the exact same thing again.
And one of the reasons Scrum is so effective is that it gives us a set of rituals to follow, right? If if I do these things,
They're reminders.
then these things happen. It's a very cyclical way. It's a very repetitive pattern that happens over and over and over again. This allows teams to not only get good at doing that pattern over and over again, but it also gives an opportunity to reflect upon how they're doing. And one of the key aspects that Scrum brings to the table that other methodologies maybe didn't stress as much is the process improvement aspect of the process. Many teams, when I used to work for IBM as a project manager, and after I got out of therapy, it's a long story, but we would do
Therapy for talking more than me?
No, he talks. Raise your hand if you think he talks more than I do. Aha. Oh, come on.
Who thinks Joel talks more than me?
I'm the one giving away the licenses now.
I'm still not winning. I'll win by the end.
So
I'm going to go check my email.
I've lost
now.
my train of thought, but that's okay. Yes, we used to have post-project reviews. We called them post-mortems, right? That's kind of an awful term. It means it's probably dead, and we have to figure out why it's dead.
Why is it dead?
Why did this project
Dig it up
die?
from the coffin.
And that's the wrong time to do reviews. And one of the things that we've always promoted is that you should build into your projects time for you to get better at your project, right? And Scrum gives you that opportunity. It gives you that cycle to do a retrospective with your team to figure out, what are we doing well? What do we need to reinforce in our processes? What can we do better? And how can we reduce waste and increase our quality? And it forces that into the rituals that we perform, every single sprint.
So while Joel was talking, I decided I would summarize Scrum in one sentence. So I will be far more articulate than he was. It is an agile methodology that's iterative and stresses communication. I don't want to forget that that's one of the core tenets of Scrum, because we didn't mention the daily stand-up. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the daily Scrum. But I want to make sure we stress that Scrum really focuses on the communication. And as Joel mentioned just a few minutes ago, before we went into our little joke, was that what happens is there's a lot of ritual around Scrum, and that daily stand-up meeting forces us into this daily communication. It reminds us that we should be communicating with the users. That's one of the areas that XP lacked. I always tell a story about XP is I was actually injured once, and I was walking back and forth talking to the marketing people so many times, and I hurt my leg about playing some sports that I just moved my desk to the marketing people. Then all my developers came to talk to me to get permission to do stuff, like go to the bathroom or, go on vacation. And then when they started asking me, can I change this database table? The marketing people would overhear them. And then they would start having conversations even when I wasn't there. Once I healed and moved my desk back, developers kept fostering that relationship. Scrum takes that a step further by formalizing that, right? And that's where Joel said where we have this kind of communication around the actual ceremony itself.
Now, Kanban is something that has been quite a growing trend in the Agile community, and it kind of stems from certain areas where Scrum maybe isn't as good. Let's think about maintenance. So let's say I have a 3-week release cycle or a 2-week release cycle, and my marketing department runs into my room and says, hey, there's a big bug on the website. And we're like, that's okay, we'll put it on our backlog and get to it in the next sprint. Because we're like, no, we're not capturing orders. Yeah, that's okay.
Because one of the core
for
tenets of Scrum is the amount of work in your sprint is fixed. There are no changes during the sprint.
So that doesn't work out so well. So one of the things that we've started to realize is people started to have like one-day iterations or one-day sprints. And, well, that's kind of neat, but there's quite a bit of overhead for a one-day sprint. A sprint review every day, a sprint retrospective every day, sprint planning,
What's your daily stand-up meeting say? What did I do today? I started the sprint. What am I going to do tomorrow? Start a new sprint. What do I need from you? Less sprints.
And one of the things that was brought to the table is, well, why don't we do this the way Lean has done it? Lean manufacturing has had a huge impact on the way we produce stuff, right? The way that we produce anything from sneakers to computers to anything. But Lean manufacturing, which is kind of birthed around the 1946-45 era, and the principles behind it, growing from Toyota, the Toyota manufacturing model, and into something that we now call Lean. has a number of things that are very agile, that we look at and we go, wow, these things could really benefit the way that our teams work. Now, Kanban itself is a Japanese word, and it comes from the concept of a signal card, which is a visual representation of some sort of token that we use to represent flow and helps us control the flow. And one of the things that it focuses on is, in fact, the flow. Scrum is very iterative, meaning that we have our cycles and we release on every cycle. What Kanban stresses is getting stuff done, but not in a very rushed or hurried way, but we have processes that allow us to focus on getting stuff done. And it provides us with a visual representation of that flow and allows us to collaborate around that visual representation to focus on the flow of value and making sure that we're actualizing that value when it gets to the end of that flow.
One of the key features of Kanban that Joel and I like is that built into the process is change. Meaning is Kanban is evolutionary by design. So meaning is it's meant to take a company, if you're using Waterfall or using Scrum Bud or something like that, you can actually start using Kanban and over time change your Kanban process to adapt to your needs. As opposed to Scrum basically walks into your organization, shakes it around, all the apples fall out of the tree, kicks the apples away and says, you're now using Scrum. Right? It is a revolutionary process. So adopting Kanban is very evolutionary in its process, and responding to change is built in. I tell the story often as one of Teleric's customers in Hong Kong, so I get to look after them. They're actually the Nike shoe company. Oh, I wasn't supposed to say that. But I always tell them, and they're always very happy. They use Kanban in their manufacturing process. So they've started putting all these lean processes in their development process. And one day I'm in the office talking to them and they're like, beating me over the head about a bug in our Silverlight controls or something. And I see a stack of Lean for Dummies books sitting on the desk. It's about a year ago. And I'm like, why are all your developers reading Lean for Dummies? And they said, we're doing Kanban. And my eyes lit up. I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm like, you're one of our largest customers and you're using Kanban. And here's what I learned from them, is they've built into the process a system and a framework to actually change their Kanban system on a regular basis, where they all submit changes to the process, not the project itself. We want less emails. So let's say goal and what we're going to do about it. And they have a meeting every month about actually doing those particular changes.
Now, here's kind of an example of a Kanban board, and it gives us a bit of a visual representation of a flow. But there's really one major important thing that I want to point out. There's these big red numbers at the top. Those big red numbers represent a limit, a limitation on how many cards could be in those swim lanes. And that's called a limited work in progress delimiter. And the reason for that is because we want to focus on getting stuff done instead of starting new things. So let's take a look at this example. I've got, a few major queues: analysis, development, acceptance, and production. Notice production, there's no limit on production, I should hope. And we also have the number 3, and it's broken down into 2 sub-queues called outgoing and done. We're saying that there can only be 3 tokens of work inside of that queue. That means that when I am a developer at the end and I'm going through acceptance and I'm moving my acceptance into production, what can I do? Start new work? Right? Go back to what's in the next queue? No, I have to work with the rest of my team to get stuff out the end of the pipe. And that's why I like using the analogy of a pipe quite a bit, is that when water moves out the end of it, sometimes I can't push more water into it until I actually get the rest of the water out. And what we're trying to do with limiting the work in progress is narrow the pipe. Because what happens when we get a much more narrow pipe? The water flows more quickly through it. So we're trying to get to done. There's no value in anything that we do until it's done, right? How far are you on your task? I'm 82% done. Yeah. What does that mean?
And we all know that 90% done takes as long as the next 10%.
That's right. So we only get value when it gets to done. So Kanban focuses on getting stuff done. And it allows us to put limitations of work in progress to allow us to focus on that. Now, why does There's a couple other things that you'll see here. One of them is a definition of done. That's a very good idea, by the way. Understanding what it means to go from state to state to state. And this is something where the evolutionary part kicks in, where the team comes up with this definition, and they'll evolve that definition over time. They're like, you know what? We're finding that the analysis isn't quite enough for us to begin development. So they will change their definition of analysis done to include maybe a bit more of a checklist that gives them a bit more robust analysis so that they can begin development. You'll also see that this particular model will help identify bottlenecks very naturally as well, because when we have blank areas in our pipe, we know that we've got a little bit of a bottleneck that we need to address. And it very clearly makes it apparent when we're looking at our Kanban board of where those bottlenecks are.
So Joel did a good job describing the Kanban board. I want to add a couple things to augment what he said. For starters, as he said, focus on the red limits. So those are the work in progress limits. This comes back from the heritage of the lean manufacturing. Okay, so this is to eliminate inventory, because where there is inventory, there is waste. Right? Inventory is just accumulated stuff. So Kanban really identifies where you have the bottlenecks. It changes the conversation, which I'll get to in a minute. But I want to focus on the evolution, right? I don't want to beat up on Scrum. I'm a certified Scrum Master. I'm a believer in a lot of the tenets of Scrum. But I want to compare it to Scrum because you all understand Scrum as a baseline. Scrum has, fixed 2-week iterations. Scrum has a lot of rules. In Kanban, next, analysis, development, acceptance, prod, that's up to you to determine the stages of your flow. Those could be 5 things, 10 things, or 3 things. It's up for you and your organization to build. The work in progress limits are set by you as well. So what would happen, as Joel said, if there was nothing in the development queue, and there were 3 things in the analysis queue and 2 things in the acceptance queue? We know that there's a bottleneck somewhere. The developers are working too fast. We need to focus on the bottlenecks in analysis or acceptance.
Have you ever worked on a team where the developers work too fast? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that was a bad analogy. So this is remember I told you before where Joel says I make bad analogies? This would be one of those times. So the reason why I wanted to bring up, kind of contrast this to Scrum is there still is a daily meeting. But the daily meeting is not about what I'm working on and what I need and all that, because that's on the board. Okay? You can't have an Agile methodology without a board, right? So instead of, in a Scrum meeting, you're all looking at each other and talking about what we're working on. In a Kanban meeting, and I've sat in on them at Nike all the time, is you're actually looking at the board. And you're talking about the process. You're talking about the flow. You're talking about the bottlenecks. As I said, this became apparent to Toyota when they wanted to say, how long does it take us to build a car? So then they got it, okay, it takes us 3 days from start to finish to build the car. Then they started saying, how can we improve that? And then they started saying, where could we eliminate waste? So that's kind of the same thing that happens. The first thing is, how do we build this piece of software? How can we improve on that process? And then ultimately, how can we eliminate waste? So Kanban focuses on that. One last thing, and then we'll review the tenets, is all of those cards represent an item that you need to work on. The theory of Kanban is that you distill your items to units of approximately the same size. So then you can accurately predict how fast they flow through the system. So you can say, if it's a work item, typically takes 4 days to flow through the system with our limits that we have in place.
Isn't that an interesting way to estimate, right? You're actually using empirical data to actually give answers of how long things will take. So if a manager comes up to you and says, how long will this take? Well, it typically takes us 4 days to get things of that size done. There's no estimation required. It's actually empirically produced. We'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow in our Kanban session.
Yeah, we're doing a Kanban talk where we'll deep dive in, I think at 1 o'clock. This room, actually, at 1 o'clock. So one last thing is when your Kanban focuses on pulling the items through the system on demand, as opposed to kind of waterfall and even XP and Agile where it's kind of pushed through in batches. So we're pulling individual work items through on demand. So we're measuring how long it takes an individual work item to get through the system. The beauty of that is you can start even going down the road of performing, doing an SLA, right? A service level agreement saying, we're going to commit to 4 days to pull these things through, the actual system itself. All right, want to go over the tenets, and then we'll start building we'll start talking about the buffet table?
Yeah, there's not a lot of rules in Kanban. In fact, that's why we consider it much more evolutionary than anything else. We've been very successful at integrating Kanban with even Scrum teams. In fact, a lot of mature Scrum teams look around and go, okay, what's next? How do we get better? And they get better by thinking about limiting work in progress, better flow visualization, and in fact, those turn out to be a lot of these Kanban principles. So the principles or the practices that you see here is that we want to visualize flow, so we want to have some form of board, whether or not it's sticky notes or some sort of electronic board like TeamPulse. We want to limit work in progress, meaning that we want to consider how much work is active at any given time.
That's the red up there, the limiting the work in progress.
We want to measure flow, meaning that we're concerned about things that are...
how long it takes to flow through the
system. We call that cycle time in the Kanban world. It's how long it takes for one sticky note to go from the beginning to the end. How fast does water go from the beginning of the pipe to the end of the pipe? And that allows us to measure our process and the velocity of our team a little bit more accurately. We want to make processes very explicit. If you go back a slide, you'll see that we have definition of done all the way along, and the team defines that. Kanban doesn't have a rule for what that should contain. It suggests that the team defines what done is, so that it's a set of checklists that we know that we have to accomplish before we move that sticky over. And of course, using models to give us an indication of where we can improve our process. Kanban, because it is so visual, will give us very early indications of where we need to tweak our processes to reduce waste, to remove bottlenecks, and to optimize our flow.
If you build the Kanban board, it'll be obvious very quickly where you need to address your process to actually improve it. And I just want to reiterate, I know we're not doing Kanban justice, the quick 10-minute lightning overview, but by using this particular system, by having the work in progress limits defined, those numbers on the top, you then have the opportunity to address them. You say, okay, we have waste in analysis. Maybe we need to fire this guy and hire a new guy, or maybe we need to shuffle, whatever it is. You make that change, and then you can change your limits. Maybe the 3 can go to a 5.
Steve and I joke a lot about whether or not Agile is going to solve all of your problems, and it won't. It'll expose them. Faster. And that's what we like to focus on, is that we like to expose those problems faster to allow them to address it quicker. And we've had a lot of teams, when they're adopting Agile, actually experience quite a bit of pain because they didn't know what they didn't know before. And they're like, this Agile stuff is killing us. Yeah, but now we can fix the problem versus not knowing it existed before.
Yeah, we always joke, we ask people when we do some Agile coaching or even in sessions like this, how many of you are working on a dysfunctional team? Like everyone raises their hand, and we say, Agile's not going to fix that. It's going to expose it. It's actually going to make it more dysfunctional. And unfortunately, Agile doesn't tell you how to fix it. It just sets up the situation and creates the framework for you to fix it by fostering the communication and building some processes around it.
Now, here are some very interesting stats, and we're going to...
I want to take a quick poll of the audience.
All right.
Who would think this would be better as a pie chart? One guy. I like that guy. Free Telerik tool for you. I put this in as a pie chart, he changed it.
I changed it back to the original stat. What this indicates is that Agile is a quite predominant methodology. Look at what the second most predominant methodology is. Oops, sorry. No process whatsoever.
If it was a pie chart, it would be obvious.
There's his pie chart. No development methodology whatsoever is the second most common methodology. And I also have to argue that if, back to my story of going into an organization and asking them what methodologies they use, and they say, dude, we use Agile because we don't document anything. I also kind of question how much of the Agile stat is a little bit of that as well. So Agile is very, very predominant.
But iterative development and Spiral, some of the other ones, are also have their roots in Agile.
Here's something that I also want to point out
in a pie chart.
How many people want to adhere to a single Agile methodology is about 31%, but the majority of people actually mix and match with something else. Right? There's either a mix and match of different Agile processes and methodologies, or there's a mix and match of Agile and non-Agile methodologies. A very common, I used to work for a consulting company, and the very common model that we used to look at is a Prince 2 combined with Scrum type of model that allows people to kind of have a much more broader management of the life cycle.
Tell them what Prince 2 is, Joel.
Prince 2 is a much more formalized project management methodology for managing customer engagements and customer interactions and planning models and risk tracking models and issue tracking models and budget
But they
models.
seem only to use in the UK.
No, they're using it in Canada as well.
No, that's part of the UK. It just the Queen,
And in Holland.
the Queen is on your money.
I love the Queen.
Yeah, I know. All right. So, our buffet table, finally. Okay, so now we've successfully kind of indoctrinated you about the Agile Manifesto. You might have been told by your Agile coach or your boss or your Scrum Master training class that don't change your methodologies around. We've told you that you can change. And what we want to do now is talk about building the actual methodology itself based on a particular scenario. So want to get rolling on that? I'll pull up a chair.
I make him do all the typing.
Because I type so fast. All right. So how are we going to do this, Joel? What's our scenario going to be? Let the audience choose a scenario while I pull up the world's greatest project management tool of all time.
Well, let's
Team Pulse.
let's think about some common scenarios. Like, who has a distributed team? Okay.
That's good.
Who has a distributed team across a wide range of time zones? Let's even take this even further, like seven time zones.
We were in India a couple weeks ago. And we did outsourcing, so we know that won't work here. But what about maybe it's more enterprise here at TechEd? How many people have a distributed team like in an enterprise?
Like in a big org that you're
Big
doing?
org? Not as many as I
Not
thought.
as many.
Come on, Joel. Give us a scenario.
Well, yell out some scenarios of your environment. Maybe we can design one on the fly.
We have
for
a
you.
new
Anybody
distributed
some
project.
thoughts? New staff of two. Doesn't sound too exciting.
Just use Kanban. You're done. Staff of two. We could. Let's table that one. But I like that. Staff of two.
Anybody else?
So I'll just say, I'll do this way. Small team.
Sorry, they're yelling some stuff.
Okay.
Sorry? Across 3 continents.
All right. So distributed across time zone. Are they contractors or work for you?
Both.
Sir, with the small team, they're together, I assume. They're not like one guy's in Germany and one guy's in New York. Okay. So small
They're
team.
actually sitting right there.
They're both right there. Small team. Different states? Oh, but you are distributed. Okay, so we'll sort of get you with the distributed, but we'll multiple time. There we go. So look, we're satisfying the small team requirement.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a small team distributed across multiple time zones. So instead of 2, we'll just say a small team. That work?
What kind of project?
What kind of project? Greenfield, brownfield, yellowfield? Does everyone know what yellowfield is? I hope not, because I made it up.
Greenfield.
Greenfield.
Who here works on greenfield projects?
Can I come work
Like
for
those
you?
are brand new ones? Wow.
I'll give you my LinkedIn address for my CV, Greenfield projects.
There's a security officer who wants to sign up. You know, there's sign up.
Oh, okay.
No French Canadians are allowed in the room.
There's
Can you say his name in French Canadian? That's how you say his name in French Canadian. He's from Canada. I don't know
So
if you know
there's governance required, right? There's sign-off and governance required. Heavy customer interaction? Okay.
Customer changes their mind all the time.
Oh, wait, that's
that's
not
a-
a scenario.
that's a
That's just
given.
a fact of life.
That's a constant.
I put that down. OBD. Oh, by the way. Okay, so does all of this make sense to build one scenario, or should we build maybe 2 different scenarios? We've got 22 minutes, so we could probably do 2. So meaning is we can do a greenfield across multiple time zones, and then we can focus on the interaction with sign-off governance with the OBTWs built in. Does that make sense? Everyone, right? So let's do this small distributed team first. All right. I'll just say distro. All right, so let's go back in and look at, I wish I could project 3 slides at once, but I'm going to refresh everyone's memory. We'll first look at the principles of, that's Agile. We'll look at the core tenets of XP. So what are some of the core practices of XP for a distributed team that's small across multiple time zones? Or it could be a big team as well. I don't want to do you guys a disservice, but I actually think you're going to feel the same pressures with two members that you might feel with 6 members. 12 members, maybe not. But because you're in multiple time zones in multiple states. So obviously you can't sit together. I should probably make this slide a little bigger.
Whole team being in the same room, kind of tough.
Kind of tough. So how about Slack?
Can you build in Slack into your capacity? Yeah.
All right, so
That's definitely something we want to do.
and well, let's actually take where it comes from, and then we'll say Slack. So what I'm going to do
Can we
is
pivot on that later?
Yeah, we
We
can
can create a chart.
You could do a pivot table on that, and Excel is not letting me change. Oh, there we go. All right. I'm not the best Excel person in the world, though it is the best tool ever.
We can see that.
Yes. Okay. So you're the one who insists. So I think personally, what do you guys feel about some of the engineering practices of XP? When you have a distributed team, what do you feel about what are the pressure points and pains you feel? Oops.
I like stories. By the way, I'm a big fan of user stories, defining the interaction between personas and the software that's being used, and looking at the value and the goals of the particular user. So I vote we put in stories as a way of capturing those requirements and specifying.
Well, you are the
software.
presenter, so you can do whatever you
I can
want.
do whatever I want.
Um,
Continuous integration. These are no-brainers. Got to have them, right? Continuous integration.
I think, to be honest, that's more important than Slack and Stories. I think when you have remote distributed teams, you can step on each other so much easier in that respect. All right, so let's go to Scrum, and let's look at some of the core principles of Scrum. And obviously, cross-functional teams. How do you guys do it? Does one guy in one? Are you like the DBA and you're like the UI guy? You're both, so cross-functional works.
Cross-functional.
What about the other people who shouted out teams? Do we like cross-functional?
Is that going to work?
Or should we have, Bangalore only do UI, hand it off to, New York that does...
I think that's going to be a tough one. I
Okay.
think in distributed teams, we're probably going to have some testers over there, some analysis over there. I'm really thinking that we're going to have some specialties.
What about the daily Scrum?
I don't think you can live without that.
I agree.
And I think it's even more important for distributed teams to have a daily scrum and perhaps even a scrum of scrums, right? So that a person from each of the different teams meet afterwards, after the local scrums, to have an interaction with one another.
So what do we feel about fixed iterations, like the 2-week iteration? We just spoke to you about Kanban. Do we feel that a fixed formalized process works better with a distributed team, or something like Kanban would work better? What do you guys feel about that?
I think fixed, because that allows the teams to come together at regular cycles no matter where they are, right?
Okay, one guy did think Kanban would work better, but I agree with you that it'd be fixed. Tell him why you think fixed is better.
Because it's that integration cycle. It's like continuous integration. That's automated build. Our teams get to reset each other and resynchronize with one another at the end of every sprint. That reset period is really important to synchronize all of our teams across geographies.
The beautiful thing about the buffet table, Joel and I had breakfast this morning with my wife. Joel and I had the exact same thing for breakfast. We had an omelet with bacon and sausage.
You had potatoes.
Okay, we had almost, but we deviated. And my wife had like oatmeal, fruit, banana, yogurt, all that healthy stuff.
And then she went to yoga.
Then she went to yoga and we came here, which I think is better, but yeah, better than yoga. So meaning is, you think that Kanban will work better in your environment, you're not wrong, right? We're giving some guidance that we feel from our environment. By all means, mix and match those items. Anything else from Scrum? Obviously, I guess the concept of self-managing teams probably doesn't work as well.
It's a little tough, right? Self-managing teams across distributed environment.
All right, let's go back to our good friend Kanban. And I think some of the things that work well in Kanban, what do you think there, Joel?
I think the definition of done, I don't think you can live without. I think everybody should agree on what done means.
Okay, so that's make policies explicit. What about the evolutionary nature of Kanban, right? Maybe playing adherence to that. We have a distributed team, and the story I told you about Nike, they actually distribute the work between Hong Kong and Portland. And there's a 16-hour time difference between Hong Kong and Portland. So they have very little time to actually go together, but it's a distributed team, and they're using Kanban pretty well in that respect. So they like the evolutionary process They like the evolutionary process as well.
I also think that having a visual board is almost like continuous integration for me. I can't conceive of any form of software development these days without having some visual representation of the states that my work
But Joel,
is in.
how will they have a physical board when they're remote teams?
Well, I've actually seen a couple of implementations. There are, of course, electronic boards. The new version of TFS obviously is going to have a task board that people can share. There's other tools on the market, Team Pulse, that could help you do that today. But I've also seen environments where they've set up a Skype camera on a physical board and actually shared, did the sharing of the desktop. I mean, you can do all of that stuff, just some physical representation of flow.
In our Kanban talk tomorrow, we'll demo a visual board not named Team Pulse tomorrow because we can't talk about our own products.
But it
Joel.
integrates with Team Pulse.
We're not allowed to talk about our own products in it.
I also kind of want to get back to Mario's suggestion is that there's some governance required and sign-off.
That's for the next scenario. We have 15 minutes, so we can definitely do one more scenario.
All right.
Yeah, Mr. Anything else that you want to pull in from our Agile board? We like the daily Scrum, so we like having a fixed iteration. Scrum does not prescribe any engineering practices, so we're going to say, CI. What about test-driven development? I guess it really doesn't matter, right? I mean, I guess that's really a personal preference of the team. But we like the concept of user stories. Scrum actually does not prescribe user stories either. That comes from XP. We took the daily Scrum and the fixed iteration. Anything else from Scrum?
Retrospectives, reviews.
Yeah. I like all of that.
Yes, star. You could. In fact, we have a lot of, the question was, why couldn't we do limiting work in progress, kind of taking a flavor of Kanban? And I actually kind of like that. So inside of your sprint, sometimes teams like to get everything started really quickly, and then at the end of the iteration, they're racing to get it all done. So nothing is done until like the last day before the iteration. So you get stories like, so how you doing on your work? Oh yeah, I'll be done by Thursday. I'm like, all right. Everybody will be done by Thursday, and all of a sudden Thursday comes and like half of the stuff that they thought would be done is done. So one of the things that we could do within a sprint is limit the work in progress that forces people to work a bit more linearly on the work that they're trying to deliver within the sprint. I talk about that in some of my other sessions, and I call that kind of a Scrum band model, which really does work really well.
And just one thing though, you do have to actually kind of change the model because they are different. Sprint gives a bunch of work to do in a fixed iteration. What I think we failed to mention, because we're doing the lightning introduction to Kanban, Kanban has no concept of sprints. There is no actual durations of your delivery. You're always just constantly delivering these items, pulling them through the system. You get what's called the delivery cadence, meaning is the cycle, it's almost like team velocity, right? The amount of work that you can flow through the system. But you don't actually have a fixed duration the way you do in Scrum.
Some people are tweeting that we should have had our Kanban session before this one. We know.
Talk to the tech ed organizers.
People.
We told them that. I told them just have them back to back. They said, oh, we don't want to tire out you and Joel, blah, blah.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. How is definition of done different from acceptance criteria in Scrum?
Very similar. Acceptance criteria, though, in a lot of cases is used at the very end, though, for accepting what the product is supposed to be doing. Whereas the definition of done is, when am I done analysis? When am I done design? When am I done, of parts of the flow? Yeah.
Right, yeah. So you didn't hear the question is, what's the difference between done in Kanban, the definition of done, and acceptance criteria in, in Scrum and XP? And exactly right, is more about the process in this case. Okay, so do we think we have an agile methodology for small-ish distributed teams? Does this look good? Yes? I can't hear what he said.
Planning game.
Planning poker?
Planning poker, like just the planning
We
game.
can use planningpoker.com in a remote team.
He's not even a shareholder.
He's not even a shareholder.
Yeah, you need a product backlog. A list of things you
What
want
is
to
our
get
session?
done.
DPR
DPR 306?
306. That's our agile methodology's name.
So put in there a product backlog.
Product backlog. Well, I would say story/backlog.
Sure.
And I think backlog actually comes from XP, even though it's famous in Scrum.
Yeah.
Just to keep it in there. Okay, so here's our methodology. We're looking at, planning poker really stresses communication, right? Slack addresses kind of the structure of our team. Stories and backlog is kind of prescription for how we're actually going to push items through the system. Continuous integration is more of an engineering process. Then we have the daily scrum, again, stressing communication. We've chosen a fixed iteration. We're going to try to limit the work in progress in the iteration. I actually think that's by design anyway, so I think that's part of the process. We like the idea of retrospectives, the sprint planning meeting, the sprint review meeting, the postmortem. We like from Kanban the explicit policies, the evolutionary process, and the actual visual board itself. All right, we have 10 minutes, so we can do one more. So we did kind of the small distributed team. So let's do a greenfield project with kind of high customer interaction and some governance, and of course, the customer changing their mind all the time.
Right.
So we'll just call this...
Now, this is kind of interesting because the governance thing is not really well represented in some of the methodologies that we talked about today. You can put governance around things like Scrum for sign-off and so forth, but I've also found that looking at a much broader engagement management system or engagement management methodology really helps with the ceremony required for delivering inside of a governance environment where we have to have sign-off and approvals and a bit more ceremony for us to deliver software. This is where I will actually bring up Prince 2. And I know that,
not on the buffet table, Joel.
It's not on the buffet table, but
a vegetarian buffet.
We've just asked the guy behind the counter, "Excuse me, sir, do you have any Prince 2 behind there?" And he goes, "One moment," and brings out a new platter. That's the beauty of how we approach things, is that we allow us to bring stuff to the table that may not be prescriptive for us in the first place. Prince 2 is much more of an engagement management model, and it works really, really well for environments that have the requirement for governance, sign-off, formality, oversight, and so forth, and works really, really well with Agile models. In fact, the way that they intersect with the way that the dev team works is very, very natural. And we found very good synergies between the Prince 2 mindset and the way that you manage the engagement itself and Scrum specifically, because it works very much a very cyclical manner, just like Scrum does.
I'm just putting some references for folks as you're talking. I'm actually making a productive slide. Okay.
Normally he makes fun of me right now.
Usually I do, because he talks about pet insurance, but not today. So we got 9 minutes to go, so let's build our second methodology. And our second methodology will most likely be different. It will look the same, but different, right? So what's some of the things that we should put in for high governance and high customer interaction?
Well, I mean, obviously, an engagement management model like Prince 2, so put Prince 2 in there, but also specifically the review process in Scrum. The review process in Scrum is critical to be a part of that sign-off process, because the review process is where we sit down with our customer, show them what we've done, and get that feedback or acceptance on what we just produced.
One of the other things that I would add from Scrum is actually, again, using a fixed iteration. Because if there is a governance model and high customer interaction, it forces, remember we talked about the ceremony around Scrum? So it will force every 2 weeks to have that customer engagement. So it will give us the opportunity to then get that feedback from the customer. And in this particular case, if there's governance or regulation involved, we can actually get those sign-offs on a regular basis, as opposed to XP and Kanban that don't really have any formality around the delivery process. Agree?
I didn't even hear what you said.
Then just say yes.
Yes.
I spelt duration wrong.
So the question, the suggestion was have a dedicated product owner, someone who's an expert in what those governance rules are.
Okay, I like that. What else should we do? Let's go back to XP real quick. XP, in this particular case, we are not, I guess, a distributed team, so we can do things like having them sit together. Would that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the top four for sure. The energized work, informative workspace, whole team, that's what we try to achieve when we're working together, is really have a lot of collaboration with one another. Not to the point it's distracting for us so we can't get everything done, so it has to be informative, meaning that we sit together so that we can be informed together.
And what about using pair programming, right? So kind of for like the legality issues, right? If we have kind of like government regulations, sign-offs, and things like that. Does that make sense for everybody? Right?
We found that the higher the level of governance, the more oversight that there needs to be, and pair programming does work well in some of those situations.
And do we still like things like continuous integration and, test first approach and all that?
I'm not sure you can sacrifice any of those. There's a So the question was, is pair programming really two devs sitting side by side, or can we change the rules of pair programming and have a review process, or someone kind of stub out the methods and other people implement it and vice versa, or write test case for the methods? That's kind of where you're asking? Well, I've seen all of those implementations, and all of them have been successful. I think the original intent of pair programming is literally two developers sitting on the same machine, writing the same code. It's the original intent. That doesn't float everyone's boat.
Yeah. I mean, pair programming literally would look like this. I would just say, function, blah, blah.
No, call that XX.
XX, whatever. Return. And then Joel will take the keyboard literally out of my hands and then fill in the implementation of that function. I wish code was that simple. Well, that's what C++ looks like. So that's. Okay, so let's wrap this up. We got 5 minutes to go. The yellow light is flashing. We're almost done. What else from Scrum, before we look at Kanban, do we think we can, or I think we fixed everything from XP, because I put sit together star, which is all of those kind of fostering the communication. The pair programming, more for the legality and getting the oversight. TDD and CI, we kind of like everywhere. Well, at least CI, maybe not TDD everywhere. So in Scrum, we kind of bounced around. We said the retrospectives, the formality, the fixed duration that we like because it gives us that ceremony of the sign-off every 2 weeks. Having the explicit product owner. What about having that daily Scrum, since we had high customer interaction and things like that?
Yeah, I think, some of those things I can't conceive, being
Ever
removed.
doing away from.
Taking away the daily Scrum, taking away those things just seems like a sacrilege to me.
And let's just go fast forward and look at Kanban. Is there anything from Kanban that we can borrow to create this particular?
I think we have to emphasize a few things like making process policies explicit. If it's more governance, we need to have much more explicit acceptance across all the phases. And that might include more work around the analysis aspects of what we're doing as well. Especially in high governance environments, we can't just sit down and start coding. We actually have to do a little bit of work up front to make sure we're adhering to some of the things that we need sign off for.
And what about the continuous improvement? I actually think in an environment where you have constant customer, almost micromanagement, and you have constant changes, that no one methodology is ever going to work. You're going to stumble across the perfect policy after a while. So I would say, the evolutionary nature of Kanban, bringing that into our notion. As I said, how Nike had built into their process. They always, every month, were voting on ways to make the process more efficient. So I'm going to say, models to suggest improvement. All right, is this about done?
It's pretty good. I think what you've seen is more emphasis on certain things than others, but there's a commonality across a lot of these things.
Well, let's just take a quick, before we go, we have about 2 or 3 minutes to go, and we want to wrap up, and of course, send you off and farewell. But real quick, before we wrap up the session, is let's just compare the two together, because there actually are a lot of similarities, though this one borrows heavily more than the other one. So this was the distributed team. We tried to make it, for a smaller distributed team, 2 to 7 people, 10 people maximum, not a humongous team. And if you notice, we look a lot here with communication, with the daily Scrum. We chose fixed iterations. That seemed popular on both. And we actually borrowed a lot from all three. In this particular case, we really kind of equally distributed across XP, Scrum, and Kanban. And when you look at the other one, that was the high governance greenfield project that had a lot of sign-offs and handoffs to the users, interaction. If you look at it, we really looked at heavily from Scrum and XP more than we did Kanban in this particular case. We really liked all of the things that foster communication, both in Scrum and XP. Even pair programming fosters communication. We also like continuous integration. This one comes up in every process we build. We think continuous integration is really taken for granted these days. And we liked having the explicit policies built right in. And so our two methodologies were definitely different, right? We came up with 2 scenarios. And just to go back a little bit here, even though we have the daily Scrum, notice I put via Skype. right? Because we have a distributed team over multiple time zones. In this particular scenario, you should choose a time that works best for all the teams and change the questions of that daily scrum, right? The daily scrum is, what did you do today? What do I need to do tomorrow? So if one guy's in the morning and starting the day and one guy is finishing the day, obviously the questions of that daily scrum are going to change. That kind of violates the rules of scrum, so I'll put a scrum star on that particular one. But in this particular case, the daily scrum is just fine because we said the team is greenfield, they're sitting together, they're working together, so you can actually do the more formal kind of way with scrum. So these are our two policies, these are our two methodologies. We can sit and do this all day, but unfortunately, we're out of time. Do we have a finalized goodbye slide, Joel?
No.
No, we
Maybe.
don't. What?
Maybe.
I'll just go back to the front page because that has our Twitter address and all that other stuff. So we're just about out of time. We only got about a minute to go. So we'd like to actually wrap up and say thanks for coming. We hope you enjoyed the session. We took a very unique approach to a session. We tried to be interactive. Let us know via Twitter, via your comments on the evaluation forums, if that interactivity worked, if it started, started spurring the creativity for you to go and build your own agile process, for you to kind of go and eat off the buffet table as well. So once again, I'm Stephen Forte.
I am Joel from Canada.
He is Joel from Canada. And thanks for coming. Enjoy the rest of Tech Ed. We hope to see you tomorrow at the Kanban session. If not, enjoy the rest of your time this week.